all about sort of literature in the archives that we have. We've got a lot. We've got quite a bit. I was quite surprised how much we had, and I've been collecting bits over the years. But so as well as the sort of the main writers of Gurney, Harvey, Haines, Moore, and Lee, there are a few others as well. We can't cover everybody, but I've tried to make it sort of a nice broad-based talk, and hopefully people will find something they didn't know about. So we'll go straight onto it. So first, obviously, F.W. Harvey, known as the Laureate of Gloucestershire. He sort of came to a national attention with his poetry describing the county, which was written when he was serving in the First World War, and it really did capture the imagination of the public. First published in 1916, his poetry initially described sort of the humour and the tragedy of army life, really. And he later combined it with a great legal career, became a popular broadcaster in the BBC, and he was quite an accomplished singer and a lecturer. Probably what people really remember about him, he's a real passionate advocate for the Forest of Dean and its people, and he was widely loved throughout the forest for his generosity and also his kindness. So when World War I was declared, he was eligible for a commission, but instead, and it's his sort of person he applied and actually joined his local territorial battalion, which was the 5th Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment, and he joined as a private. So he could have gone as an officer, but no, he went with the common soldier. And it was really here that his writing skills came to the fore, especially when he became a founding member and key contributor to the World War I's trench newspaper, the 5th Gloucester Gazette, which you can see a sort of a front page of one there. These were put together in the trenches and printed through various means. And a lot of his writing started off in there. A lot of his poetry was published there. Just an aside, I mean, contrary to public opinion, the Gazette, 5th Gloucester Gazette, was actually the first trench newspaper. It was the first edition was published on 1st of April 1915, whereas the more famous the Wipers, Times and Salient News wasn't published in February 1916. So the Gloucestershire Regiment got there first. Harvey was soon promoted to Lance Corporal. They recognised his skills and his leadership, and he was later awarded for decorated for gallantry, after which he was returned to England and was then commissioned as an officer. He returned as an officer in the 2nd 5th Gloucestershire Regiment as a second lieutenant, and laughingly his commanding officer said the only reason he'd be commissioned so it meant he could have a batman to keep his stuff in order, because he was basically so untidy. So I think you get a picture of what this man was like, and you know, unfortunately, in August 1916, he was carrying out a solo reconnaissance of a German frontline trench when he was captured, and he spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. But while he was a POW, it gave him time to write. So this is where he produced 2 volumes of poetry, which was sent home and published. And this is what brought him into the public eye, really. He came from a Minsterworth farming family, but after the war, he settled in the village of Yorkley in the forest, and he trained to become a solicitor, specialising in defending those who couldn't afford legal representation. So really forward-thinking man here, wanting to help the sort of the poor folk. He was also a strong advocate for veterans of both world wars, and also he stood up to local injustices. He knew Ivor Gurney, and after the war, he renewed his friendship with him. But it basically the medical sort of decline of Gurney and the need for Harvey to support his family led him to concentrate more on his legal career as time went by. And he actually wrote his last volume of poetry called Farewell in 1921. His best known poem is Ducks, and there's the first verse of it down there. It's always included in BBC's Nation's Favourite Poems. Personally, I prefer a couple of others, which we'll look at in a moment. But he's also widely respected for other works, such as In Flanders is a famous one, which was actually put to music by Ivor Gurney. His legal work, broadcasting, sporting life, and love of socialising, he was a great one for nipping down the pub and chatting with people, meant that it only was sporadically published after 1921, although his work continued to be included in school textbooks, anthologies for children, anthologies for war, and also anthologies for nature poetry. He died in 1957, was buried at Minsterworth, but his, if you're interested in his legacy, is kept alive today by the F.W. Harvey Society. So if you have any interest in him, you have to go and look at this site. It's very good. And we'll just have a couple of quick looks at poems. This is one of my favourites, Piper's Wood. It's from a wood in Minsterworth. The trouble with his poems, a lot of them have been put to music by Johnny Coppin. So I can't read this very well without starting to sing it, and I won't put you through that pain. But if you have a look at it, Minstworth when marches in and spring begins to gild the days, oh, then starts up a joyous din, for Piper's Wood is full of praise, because the birds deem winter gone and welcome the returning sun. And we're almost at that time of year now where you're hearing the birds, you've got the daffodils coming out. This is the time of year that actually Harvey would have absolutely loved. So that's Piper's Wood, and perhaps maybe the poem we all know best in Gloucestershire, the Song of Gloucestershire. This is a fantastic poem and song. I won't do it all to you, but just look at those words: north, south, east, and west. Think of whichever you love the best. Forest and vale and high blue hill, you may have whichever you will. So quaff one cup to the love of your soul before we drink to the lovely whole. And in this poem, he goes through the various places. You've got the Cotswolds, you've got the forest, you've got Berkeley, and it's such a wonderful poem. And if you can catch it, have a listen to Johnny Coppin's version of it, which is absolutely brilliant. Moving on from Harvey, we come to Gurney. Born in 3 Queen Street in Gloucester, 1890, he was the second of 4 children to a tailor and his wife Florence, the seamstress. Baptised at All Saints Church in Gloucester, and that's the baptism entry for him there. He showed a clear musical ability at a very early age, and in 1900 won a choral scholarship to Gloucester Cathedral, which also brought with it a place at the King's School, which is where he met F.W. Harvey. He sang as a Gloucester Cathedral chorister from 1900 to 1906, became a pupil of Dr. Herbert Brewer, and this is where he met fellow composers Herbert Howells, and he also became a lifelong friend with Ivor Novello, who's another of Brewer's pupils, and we've obviously all heard of Novello and the music he did. He began composing music at 14, really young, and in 1911 he won this open scholarship to the Royal College of Music, the building there. So he moved to London. He took a job as an organist at a church to help pay his way, and he was befriended by the church warden of the High Wycombe Church, who welcomed him into his family, and this really helped Gurney and sort of got him established. One of his teachers was Sir Charles Villiers Stamford, who was very famous in his own right, but he actually did say of Gurney that of all his students, which of course including Vaughan Williams, Gustav Holst, and dozens more, Gurney was potentially the biggest of them all, but he was also the least teachable. So quite what that says about Gurney, I'm not sure. He was a naturally exuberant personality, but sadly he was also troubled by mood swings, and in 1913 he suffered what we'd now call his first mental breakdown, and for a time he left the college and returned to Gloucestershire to recover, but then thankfully became well again and went back to the college. When World War I broke out, he tried to enlist with Harvey in the 1st, 5th Gloucesters, but because of his poor eyesight, he was rejected. However, in February 1915, when they'd slackened the requirements a little bit because they realised they need more troops, he applied again and was accepted as a private into the 2nd Battalion, 5th Gloucestershire Regiment. It was at the front that he began writing a lot more poetry and music especially for Harvey's poem in Flanders, which Gurney had seen in the 5th Gloucester Gazette. And he was also started to put together a book called Seven Somme. In April 1917, he was wounded in the shoulder. He recovered quite quickly, and on his return, he was transferred to a machine gun battery based around Passchendaele. And it was here he discovered he was actually a crack shot with the machine gun. Quite what that means. You both 3 or 4 bullets, you only take one. But this is a little example of his poetry from this time. You see the rhythm of it. Memory let all slip save what is sweet of Ypres plains. Keep only autumn sunlight and the fleet clouds after rains. Which is really nice poetry. On the 17th September, however, during the 3rd Battle of Ypres, he was gassed at St Julien and was invalided back to Britain, firstly being admitted to the Bangor War Hospital in Edinburgh. Here, he was nursed by VAD nurse Annie Drummond, and he promptly fell in love with her. That made him happy for a while, but he was sort of torn in many directions here. In November, he was sent to a signalling course, but by this time his depression had started to affect him again, and he was returned to a hospital in Newcastle and Pontine. In March of 18, Drummond ended their relationship, which of course triggered a major deterioration in his condition, and he was sent to another hospital at Broadspeth Castle in County Durham. His mental condition just continued to get worse, and in May he was sent to Lord Derby's War Hospital at Warrington for treatment of a nervous breakdown. In July, again, he was transferred to the Middlesex War Hospital, which would have been a pre-war mental hospital. And it was here he's, in a way, very lucky. He received what was then a rare diagnosis of nervous breakdown from deferred shell shock. And we know the tale, some of the poor World War I soldiers who didn't get this diagnosis and were accused of just being cowards. So Gurney, in this respect, was quite lucky. He remained there until he was discharged from the army in 1918 with a sort of a fair pension, 12 shillings a week. It's good for the time. He came back to Gloucestershire, and for a while, when he reunited with all his friends, he seemed to thrive for a little while. But sadly, soon afterwards, his mental health again began to deteriorate, and this just got badder, worse and worse, until at one point he was actually believed the police were torturing him with radio waves. So he was really not very well at all. And in September 1922, his family asked for medical intervention, and he was actually certified insane and transferred to the Barnwood House, the private mental hospital in Gloucester. You know, he obviously wasn't happy here either. He did make a desperate nighttime escape, smashed the window, cut his hands, and ran off in his pajamas. He was recaptured, or saved by the police, I guess, rather than recaptured. But it decided, for his own safety, he must be taken somewhere away from Gloucestershire. So in 1922, he's transferred to the City of London Mental Hospital at Dartford in Kent. He continued writing songs until 1926, but their quality diminished. But his poetry gathered strength, and his best war poems belonged to these sort of asylum years. Sadly, he died of tuberculosis on Boxing Day 1937. He was only 47. He was brought back to Gloucestershire and was buried at Twigworth on 31st December. And his friend Will Harvey walked from the forest to attend the ceremony, and dropped a sprig of rosemary in the grave for remembrance. So Will Harvey must have been desperately sad on this occasion. Despite Gurney's famous songwriter and poet, it was initially thought that he would fade into oblivion, but a chap called Gerald Frinzi, a friend of Gurney's, Howard Ferguson, and his wife Joy, and the musicologist Marion Scott were able to sort of save it. Scott had been the registrar at the Royal College of Music when Gurney was attending it, and she'd also been largely responsible for publishing all his work, for she'd typed out all of his handwritten poems and sent them to the publishers, Sedgwick and Jackson, which resulted in his first book, Seven of Song, being published. So there was now a move to save all his work. And today, his legacy is maintained by the Ivor Gurney Society, which were doing great work in saving this stuff and organising it all, because otherwise it would have been lost, and we'd have lost a great talent to Gloucestershire. Having a look at John Haines now, born in 1875, first of 4 sons to Caroline Haines and the solicitor John Pladle Wilton Haines. The family had actually been a sort of a lawyer family, that 7 of them had been lawyers. So Haines also chose to train solicitor. After he qualified, he joined the family law firm, Haines and Summer, which is based in Bastion House, Brunswick Road in Gloucester. You can see a picture of it there. And although he was happy in this choice of career, he was actually really interested in classical and modern literature and verse, and he became an avid collector of books. And through this interest, he acquired lots of contacts in the publishing world, which led him to become friendly with many of the contemporary poets, authors, and composers of the age. And by a happy chance, many of these poets in the early 20th century were Gloucestershire regiments. We think this has come about because from the 1890s onwards, many people were leaving the countryside for work in towns and cities. And in the country, and especially in the area surrounding Dimmock, there was a surplus of empty, low-rent cottages available, which proved ideal for lowly paid, impoverished poets and their families to occupy. Among them around Dimmock, we'll look at these later: Robert Frost, Wilfred Gibson, Lascelles Abercrombie, and Rupert Brooke. And their presence, of course, attracted other literary figures: Edward Thomas, who we'll look at again later, Eleanor Faraghan, Ivor Gurney, we spoke, Davis, and Drinkwater. And Haines was able to mix with all these people on a social interest, and in turn, they would actually write to him and ask for his opinion on the poems they were writing. So in this way, Haines became a really keen sort of supporter and promoter of poems. The bulk of the collection we have in the archives consists of letters written to John Haines from lots of well-known poets, writers, and composers, and you can see some of them on the right-hand side there. However, He also did write poetry himself, so we have notebooks and writings on him from there, as well as sort of photographs of some of these people and family members. There are also papers from specific authors, including Edward Thomas, Ivor Gurney, but also the Lascelles of Abercrombie, Bullitt, Carpenter, Chesterton, Walter de la Mare is a good one, and also John Moore, who again we'll look at next. So John Moore, born 10th of November 1907, the only son of the then serving mayor of Tewkesbury. And what do we know about John Moore? He lived at Tudor House down the High Street there until the death of the father, and the family had to move. But from the age of 11, he was educated at Malvern, and at the age of 16, he left to work as an auctioneer at the Tewkesbury, the established family farm. And it was here that he actually started writing, and he wrote his first novel, Dixon's Clubs, which was published in 1930. Buoyed by this success, he abandoned the auctioneering career and moved to London, where he started writing for newspapers, magazines, and also working on more novels. On the outbreak of the war, he joined the Fleet Air Arm and was initially based at RNAS Eastleigh, where he qualified as naval pilot. In September 1941, he was on a conversion course to fly Walrus seaplanes, like the one you see picture, which were primarily used for air-sea rescue work. He actually undertook several plane crashes during this time. We don't know many of the details of these, and also at times in London was directly affected by the air raids. They did worry him immensely. And soon afterwards, he actually became ill rheumatic fever and stress, which resulted in being discharged from flying duty. So he was never allowed to fly again. He was subsequently assigned to the Admiralty Press Division and worked in confidential work relating to the construction of the artificial mulberry harbours. And we can see the picture there is the one at Arromanches, which is the British mulberry. So he worked on these and actually did a lot of work with them and to help them make them the success that they were. In February 1944, at a friend's wedding, he met Lucille Douglas Stevens, who turned out to be his future life. The couple fell in love instantly, and they were married just a few weeks later in April 1944. Lucille was an Australian in the Wrens, and the hasty marriage actually caused John's mother grave concern. She wrote to him several times, urging his son not to be so rash in this marriage, but he sort of ignored that and carried on. And they were married. John was then later actually posted to Arromanches, France, to actively take part in the Mulberry Harbour's construction. But in September, Lucille became gravely ill and she was discharged from the Wrens. And she was ultimately diagnosed with unhealed lesions in the lungs, sarcoidosis. And for this time, she returned to Tewkesbury, and basically it was John's mother, who actually looked after her. And eventually, Lucille made a full recovery, but the couple couldn't have children. And in the archives, we have sort of some lovely diaries about their cat and animal diaries. So it looks like they focused their attention on these animals rather than children. However, Lucille encouraged John to continue writing, and it's here that he achieved worldwide fame in particularly the three books: Portrait of Elmbury, Brensham Village, and The Blue Field, collectively known as the Brensham Trilogy. The books are sort of all based on his childhood experience living in Tewkesbury and Tudor House, notably opposite the Double Alley, which was a notorious area of the town, although this does not exist anymore. Like so many of Tewkesbury's alleys, it's been swept away by development. But these books are really good. They're really nice reading books. He was a real countryman. And as well as doing this, he wrote short stories, poetry, plays, film strips, and broadcasts, which he also sometimes presented. He was a born naturalist, passionately interested in country matters, and he was also really ahead of his time. He really understood wildlife conservation, the effects of pesticides, and the benefits of organic farming and meat production. So, he would have been great today as a promoter of the natural countryside and how good it is for us. He also helped found the Cheltenham Literary Festival and also campaigned to save the architecture of Tewkesbury from development. He tried to save the alleys, but he couldn't. But again, he was very much concerned, a very good sort of person to promote this sort of material. He sadly died in Bristol in 1967, and he's buried in Tewkesbury Abbey, and that's his tombstone there. Moving on to Laurie Lee, born in Uplands in Stroud in 1914. He was quite a sickly child, when he was only 7 months old in February 1915, and you probably know the story from the book. He received a private baptism, which thought he was dying, and basically he was dead, and his mum sort of panicked and ran into him, looked after him. But he did survive this, and he was baptised in Uplands Church. So you can see the entry in the baptism register there in May 1916. He had a big family, 7 older siblings, so 6 from his father's first marriage, whose mum looked after, and then 3 from his mum's marriage. So the Marjorie and the 2, Jack and the younger brother Tony, who are mentioned quite a lot. In 1917, the family moved out to Slad, although it is that Lee's father, Reginald Lee, he never returned to the family. He did send them money to keep them, but he stayed away. And I think it was he stayed in London, basically. This is Laurie Lee's home, Bank Cottages, which is now Rosebank Cottage in Slad. It's a lovely cottage, classic Cotswold T-shaped building, subdivided into 3 separate dwellings, which you've read Slide with Rosie, you'll know about. So the longer downstroke was occupied by the Lees, and the top stroke, you get the Grannies in the Rains cottage, the chapter's called. So you get Granny Truly lived on the top floor and Granny Wallen in the bottom floor. And these 2 grannies get a whole chapter in the book, and they are wonderful characters to sort of even to look and read about. Started with Rosie. I'm sure you've read it. If not, please do. It's a wonderful book, and the last chapter is especially poignant because it describes the gradual breakup of the village community after World War One, and you get motor buses, cars, and motorbikes appearing. I mean, you know, these are recorded as like some of them brought young men to court Laurie's sisters, and gradually the family began to break up, and it sort of end of Lee's rural idyll and his emergence into the wider world. And you can see that one of the last lines here: the girls were to marry, the squire was dead, buses ran and the towns were nearer. We began to shrug off the valley and look more to the world, where pleasures were more anonymous and tasty. They were coming fast and we were ready for them. You know, it's a bittersweet, great bit of writing, so sad as well. If you've read Side with Rosie, I'm sure you've probably read the other books. The most famous one is I Walked Out One Summer Morning. Around 1934, Lee left Slad, went to London. He worked as an office clerk and a builder's labourer, but in the summer of 1935, to find the world, he headed to Spain on a cargo ship. They landed at Vigo, northwest Spain, and he travelled across Spain, visiting Zamora, Valladolid, Segovia, Madrid, Toledo, Cordova, Seville, Algeciras, Malaga, and Castillo on Andalusia. And the book's wonderful. It's shows a lot of the hard times he had, but the heat, I remember, I read it, and the people, you know, really interesting, and some of the poverty in Spain there. He eked out a living by playing his violin, but was supported by various people he met on his travels, and some of these encounters are really interesting. They're really fun. You know, they were sleeping outside, drinking at nights, you know, and he met lots of really interesting people. But of course, this is Spain pre-war. The political situation was deteriorating rapidly, although this doesn't really start to make an appearance in the latter half of the book. The Spanish Civil War did break out, and in July 1936, Lee was picked up by the British destroyer HMS Blanche, which was sort of come from Gibraltar to collect British sort of citizens who were trapped in Spain. Lee returned home. He started to study for an art degree, but he returned to Spain in 1937 as part of the International Brigade. And then this is described in his book, A Rose for Winter, although his service was cut short because he had epilepsy, which had become more apparent at this time. 1960s, Lee and his wife returned to Slad, and he lived close by his childhood home, although for many years actually did commute to London and returned to Slad at weekends. After his retirement, he's often found in the Woolpack, the pub at Slad at lunchtimes. And in 1985, in the Wogan show, actually revealed that he was often asked by children visiting Slad as part of their O-level study with Side of the Rosie, "Where's Laurie Lee buried?" You know, they assumed that he was dead. And I've got a story very similar to this. So I was studying Side with Rosie at my O-levels back in the late 70s, and I actually loved it. And I sort of got on my motorbike one day, or several times, and started driving around Slad, trying to find Laurie Lee's house, which I did. And one day I thought, I'm a bit thirsty. It was a hot day. I called into the Woolpack just to catch a quick pint. I shouldn't have done it. I was underage, but it didn't matter. And there I found Laurie Lee sat in the corner. I ended up chatting to him, and basically he bought me some drinks. I bought some drinks. And the end result was I started riding my motorbike home late in the afternoon, realised I'd better not because I was far too intoxicated. So I parked it up on the wall at Bull's Cross, hopped over the field, and had a 3 or 4 hour kip in the hedge in the field. Woke up about 7 o'clock at night and then wound my way home. So, you know, if any kids listening, don't do that. It's very bad, but it's a great tale. And he was a really nice chap, I have to say. I really enjoyed chatting with him, told me lots of things. He sadly died in 1997, aged 82, and is buried in the local churchyard. And that's a photo of his gravestone. So again, if you've not read any of his books, please do, because they're all wonderful, real clear evocations of Gloucestershire and also of Spain pre-war. Frank Mansell, known as the Cotswold poet, following the success of just one volume of poetry, the Cotswold Ballads, which was published in 1969. Despite having been born in Londoner, he had actually come from a Cotswold family of farmers, and they can sort of trace their history back. It is thought to the 1300s. For most of his life, he lived at a little cottage called the Salt Box up at the camp near between Sheepscombe and Missenden, and he actually, for most of his career, he worked for the GPO telephones, retiring in 1975. In his spare time, he'd write poetry, was often published in the local press, the Citizen, and he'd also give readings of his work, and he became quite well known and quite popular because of it. However, in the area, ask anybody in the Sheepscombe, he was a keen cricketer and played for Sheepscombe Cricket Club. And this club is renowned. Its grounds are renowned for beautiful view. You can see it there, but also the sort of the sloping pitch, which often bowlers would use to their advantage. And actually, Frank went down in club history as he once took all 10 wickets in a match against Barnsley, and they only scored 8 runs. So, you know, if Sheepscombe didn't win that, they didn't deserve to. But he's got a lovely poem called Battling Against Birdley. If you've ever not read it, I recommend it. It really does evoke the joy, the fun, the camaraderie, and yet the really intense rivalry that exists even today in village cricket. So he's a great little writer, and if you haven't caught him, please do. And again, this is one of his lovely poems. I absolutely adore this poem. I'd sooner go hedging than build a stone wall, or pick up and place it and hope it don't fall. When east winds blow bitter and keen in the trees, I'd sooner lay blackthorn than dry wood and freeze. It's a lovely rhythm to it. I like doing hedging and copping energy anyway, and this poem I think really sums it up. It's wonderful. Going back in time now, a long way back, this is John Tailor, the water poet, born in St Owen's, which is a church by Gloucester Southgate, 24th of August 1578. He had some education, possibly at the Crypt School. We don't know his parentage at all, but in the early 1590s he left Gloucester and moved to London, similarly to Southwark, where he began an apprenticeship as a waterman. These are the people who ferried passengers and their luggage across and along the River Thames, so it's quite a busy occupation. He completed his apprenticeship around about 1594, 55, we think. But in 1596, he joined the Anglo-Dutch Expeditionary Force under Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex. This was going to go into a high exhibition into Spain. So he actually suddenly fought a lot in the Anglo-Spanish civil wars. See, he was there at the capture of Cadiz in 1598, and then he actually went on to the English fleet and was serving under Lord Howard in the Battle of Flores in the Azores, where they tried to capture a Spanish treasure fleet but didn't actually achieve it. After this, he came back and actually continued his previous occupation, and he actually became a member of the Guild of the Company of Watermen, who governed the watermen's activity. There were around about 2,000 licensed watermen, we think, many more unlicensed ones. And the general opinion of them, they were largely drunkards, gossips, and liars who would chiefly cheat patrons into paying extra for the service if they could. So they weren't well liked. And if you've seen the film Shakespeare in Love, where Ralph Fiennes jumps on the boat, goes across, and there's the actual ferryman trying to flog him his script, you'll get the idea. However, like that, this was actually Taylor's entry into the Literary Society of London. He ended up ferrying lots of patrons, actors, and playwrights across the Thames to the Bankside theatres. And during this, he got to know them, they got to know him, and he began to write a lot of poetry, and a lot of it they actually liked. He later became clerk of the Guild, and it's through his writings that we know there were some major watermen's disputes of the time with the theatre companies. So in 1612, the theatre companies moved the theatre from the South Bank to the north. That deprived the watermen of so much sort of traffic and so much money. So actually Taylor recorded all these things, and it's up to him we know about them. He was a prolific poet, 150 published works in his lifetime, possibly more, and he was also the first poet to mention the deaths of William Shakespeare in the 1620 poem The Praise of Hempseed. Some of his titles are a bit odd. You can see in this bottom one here, Kixie Winsey. By wondrous accent, perchance one may grope out a needle in a bed of hay, and though a white crow be exceedingly rare, a blind man by fortune catch a hare. Wonderful little poems, good stuff. We know he died in London, December 1653. He's age 75, so it's a good age, and he's buried on 5th December in St Martin in the Fields there. Moving back forward, something a bit more modern. Winifred Foley, born in Brierley in the Forest of Dean in 1914. She was the fourth of 8 children, 5 of whom survived into adulthood. Her older sister, who's Bess, 4 years older, 2 younger sisters and a brother. She was the daughter of Charles Mason, the coal miner, and his Welsh wife, and he actually didn't work in the forest pits for most of his life. He actually worked in South Wales, so he travelled a lot, but he seemed to be a great father. She went to school at Rowling Woodside, the county primary school, and afterwards moved to London. And the image we've got there is just her admission into Rowling School. She actually had a lot of political interest from a young age, and actually she met a like-minded husband, Sid, while on the way to rally against Mosley and the fascists in London. So, you know, she was quite a political creature from quite a young age. The first book, A Child in the Forest, which I think we've probably all seen or read, wasn't published until she was 60 years old. She was a very late author, and it's an account of her childhood in the forest, but also includes many of her experiences as a young servant in London. It's been compared to Cider with Rosie, but there are many differences, notably that Folly really makes clear the unending poverty of being a child in the forest at this time to a poor family. So there are stories of lots of fleas in the bed and poor sanitation and this sort of thing, which, you know, a lot of her family afterwards felt quite ashamed at her telling them this, but, you know, she wanted to tell the truth, and it does come across in the book. Subsequent works included No Pipe Dreams of Father, Back to the Forest, and In and Out of the Forest, and they're all vaguely on the same sort of themes, just more stories to do with it. And they're, again, really entertaining books to read. Later years, she moved to Cheltenham and sadly died on 21st of March 2009. A major humanist funeral was held at Cheltenham Crematorium for her. Today, there's a bench on the top of the summit of Mayhill dedicated to her and Sid. So if you wander up Mayhill, have a look for this bench, sit down, especially on a summer's evening, and look at the view across to Wales. It's brilliant. We're on Dennis Potter, born at Berry Hill near Colford, 17th of May 1935. So another forester. Forest seems to generate great authors. He attended the local grammar school, then went to London, and he spent 3 years at Oxford University. He subsequently worked in broadcasting as a journalist, and he actually tried to stand for Parliament at one time. But then he started sort of writing plays, and this is what really brought him to the fore. He is best known for the BBC TV serials Pennies from Heaven, The Singing Detective, The Blue Remembered Hills, Brimstone and Treacle, which was made into a great film with Sting, and Lipstick on Your Collar, the singing and dancing one with Robbie Coltrane. So these plays are really important and they're really good. He used the forest as people for inspiration for a lot of his work. And it's regarded as one of the most influential playwrights that's worked in British TV. Sadly died in 1994, age 59. And this little quote from him is brilliant. The trouble with words is that you never know whose mouths they have been in, which, you know, it's a very simple quote, but it's quite a deep one, really interesting. Moving on to a more modern author, J.K. Rowling. She lived in the village of Tutsall down there near Chepstow as a child. She attended Wydene Convent School near Chepstow, and there are lots of local people and places which inspired the writing. The Tutsall Tornadoes, they're a Quidditch team in the Harry Potter series. Professor Snape was based on one of her teachers. And in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Hermione recalls a holiday with her parents in the Forest of Dean, and the characters then venture into the forest while they're hiding out. And locations in Dean were used in the subsequent film to bring it to life. There's also a Muggle wood near Blaisdon. Might this be the origin of the term Muggle for non-magical people? It could be. Okay, so we're moving on. So this is a section of the talk is more of a sort of scattergun approach of things we have. So here we have Shakespeare. We've got a bit of him in Gloucestershire. Life and Death of Richard II, Act 2, Scene 3, The Wilds in Gloucestershire. Entry, Henry Bolingbroke and Northumberland with forces. How far is it now, my lord, to Berkeley now? Believe me, noble lord, I'm a stranger here in Gloucestershire. These high wild hills and rough uneven ways draw out our miles, and makes them wearisome, and yet fair discourse hath been as sugar, making the hard way sweet and delectable. You know, have we got many high wild hills? Well, we've got the Cotswolds. I'm not sure what makes them wearisome though. So, you know, maybe Shakespeare didn't know this country as well as he thought. But we've got more. Henry IV, Part 2, Act 2, Scene 4. Mistress Cheap quickly is in East Cheap. Falstaff, Mistress Doll, tear she's talking. Enter behind them, disguise Prince and Poins. So Prince is Prince Hal, Doll. They say Poins is a good wit. Oh, what's happened there? We've disappeared. Come back. Sorry about that, folks. Just getting into my flow as well. There we go. Falstaff. He's a good wit. Hang him, baboon. His wit's as thick as Tewkesbury Mustard. There's no more conceit in him than there is in a mallet. So after that, you'll see the slide I was going to show. Tewkesbury Mustard. Okay, it's a famous mustard, blend of mustard flour and grated horseradish, originated in Tewkesbury. Some of it was given to Henry V when Henry VIII when he came to visit the town. Simply prepared by grinding mustard seeds into flour, then in horseradish, and you form them into balls. These were then dried, and they could be transported and sold like this. There's an image of them there. 1535 say they were covered in gold leaf and presented to Henry VIII when he visited the town. To use them, you'd break the balls up and crumble them into a liquid. It could be water, milk, cider, or cider vinegar, depending on how you wanted it. And then you mixed it up to a thick cream and used it as a condiment, or you actually used it as a cure for ailment. So it's a multi-thing. You know, hurt bad elbow, slap some Tewkesbury mustard on it. Want a bit on your steak? Put some Tewkesbury mustard on it. You get the drift. Today, it's still made in Tewkesbury Mustard Company. They're a great company, and without doing too much product placement, you can see them there. They're online. You'd think with mustard flour and horseradish, this would be like fire, but it's actually not. It doesn't actually burn your mouth or sting your nose like English mustard can. So if you've not tried some, buy yourself a little pot and have a taste of it. It's actually really pleasant stuff. Moving on. Alice in Wonderland or Charlton Kings. So the story of the little girl who falls down the rabbit hole and finds herself in a strange magical world is actually thought to be based on Alice Liddell, who is a girl who visited grandparents who lived in Charlton Kings. Her grandfather was Dr. Henry Liddell, Dean of Christ Church College in Oxford, and was a friend of Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, who is better known under his pen name of Lewis Carroll. He was a maths teacher at Oxford, and one day in July 1862, he took Alice and her sisters on a boat trip along the Thames from Folly Bridge, which is just below the college, out to Godstow, which is in the northwest of Oxford. On the journey, Alice asked them to tell him a story to keep them amused. So Carol invented a story about Alice and the White Rabbit. She asked him to write it down. The rest is history. 3 years later, it was published as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The Liddells lived in Hetton Lawn, Cudnall Street, and Charlton Kings, and Carol often visited there and took lots of photos of the family and the children. And although there's been some suspicion that he might have had too much of an interest in children, it is known that the parents were always there, and this was not actually a worry for them at all. The picture taken in the garden, as you can see from the map, it actually did face south, and there's a part that's the front of the house today. So there was a big lawn there, lots of light. So it's really good for photography. And there are actually lots of links between Alice Liddell and Alice in the Carroll's books, although they're all actually found in the sequel, which is Through the Looking Glass. They include the fact that the story was set on the 4th of May, which was Alice Liddell's birthday. The fictional Alice is the same age as the real Alice. And then the poem at the end of Through the Looking Glass, if you read it downwards, it spells out Alice Liddell's name. So there seems little doubt that Alice was actually the Alice in Alice in Wonderland. W.E. Henry, you've probably heard about him, English poet, writer, critic and editor in the sort of late 1850s, born in Gloucester in 1849, oldest of 6 children. In 1868, when he was 19, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the bone, and this resulted in amputation of his left leg below the knee, which he thought might have held him back. But he survived, and he moved to London and became quite a well-known journalist and became a fixture in the literary circles of the day, especially after his poem Victus, which I'm sure we've all heard and read about, was published in 1875. In 1878, he moved to Scotland and married Hannah Boyle, and they had a child, Margaret Emma, in 1888. She was sadly a very sickly child, but before she died, she actually became the inspiration for the character Wendy in J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. So we've got another link into Gloucestershire, which we'll look at in a minute. course, what the best of things Henley remembered for, he was a great friend of Robert Louis Stevenson, and according to Stevenson's letters, Henley was the character inspired for John Silver. One of his letters that Stevenson wrote Henley, "I'll now make a confession. It was a sight of your main strength and masterfulness that begot Long John Silver. The idea of the maimed man ruling and dreaded by the Seine was entirely taken from you." So, you know, again, thanks to a Gloucestershire character, here we have one of the best loved characters of all time, Long John Silver. Thomas Dover, we've probably not enough heard of Thomas Dover. He was born in Barton-on-Heath near Stratford. His grandfather was Robert Dover, who was the founder of the Chipping Campden Cotswold Olympics. After attending Chipping Campden Grammar School, Thomas went to Oxford and then Cambridge to study medicine. In 1696, he moved to Bristol after he qualified, and he started working for the Bristol Corporation of the Poor. He also established his own quite lucrative medical practice, and he eventually became known as Dr. Quicksilver for his use of mercury, and inventor of the cold and fever medicine Dover's powder. This success, and he became quite wealthy, allowed him to buy a house in Bristol's rather fashionable Queen Square, which also happened to be the home to Woodes Rogers. Remember that name. He was an English sea captain, a privateer, slave trader, sadly. And from 1718, he was the first royal governor of the Bahamas. Keep the name there. 1708, a chap called William Damper, again, an explorer, pirate, privateer, navigator, and naturalist, arrived in Bristol, basically to secure funding for a new privateer voyage to capture a Spanish treasure ship. He was known to Dover, Dover met him, and Dover bought into this plan and became part owner and second captain of the 36-gun ship, the Duke, which you can see there in the picture. That's a drawing of it. This was commanded by his neighbour, Woodes Rogers. So it's a bit of a family thing going on here now. Everything's fine. They all set sail in 1708. On the 2nd of February 1709, off South America, they'd gone round the Horn, a light was seen on the uninhabited Juan Fernandez Islands. What's it doing there? Dover led a landing party to investigate. Here they discovered Alexander Selkirk, the Scottish sailor who'd been abandoned on the island in 1705. Dover rescued the Scot, and this became the inspiration for Robinson Crusoe, which is written by Daniel Defoe, a friend of Woodes Rogers. So this is, again, lots of lovely literary connections coming into Gloucestershire here. Dover, however, he never went to sea again afterwards. He'd made so much money on this cruise, it did do quite well. He did lose it all in the South Seas bubble, but he sort of dragged himself back up and became very close friends with Robert Tracy from Gloucestershire. And he moved into Tracy's house, and the pair stayed together, you know, as friends for the rest of their lives. Dover died in 1742, and he was buried in the Tracy family vault at Stanway. So again, this is another little link into Gloucestershire. Neverland in Gloucestershire. So James J.M. Barrie, Scottish novelist and playwright, obviously best known as the creator of Peter Pan. He was born and educated in Scotland, moved to London, where he wrote lots of successful novels and plays. But in London, he met the Llewellyn-Davies family and their sons, who inspired him to write Peter Pan, the boy who wouldn't grow up. In 1904, it's a play about an ageless boy, a fairy called Tinker Bell, and a girl named Wendy, who, don't forget, was inspired by Henley's daughter, sadly died. And they grew up and have an adventure in Neverland. He continued to write successfully after the success of Peter Pan, but it overshadowed everything else he did. And before his death, he made the real magnanimous gesture. He gave the rights to Peter Pan to the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, and that hospital continues to benefit from them today. And as long as Peter Pan stays popular, which it will, it's a great story. You know, that hospital is going to benefit. So what's the connection with Gloucestershire? Well, actually, it's Stanway House. He often came to visit the house. He was a friend of the family there, the Traces, and he knew them quite well. He was also a great cricket enthusiast, though he wasn't a brilliant player. And he actually then paved the pavilion at Stanway Cricket Ground, which is known as Pan's Pavilion. That's a picture of it today. It's still there. It's a blessing and a curse for the cricket club because it's a listed building, so they can't really improve it at all because they haven't got the money, sadly. But he did this for them. In 1887, he actually founded an amateur cricket team with friends of limited playing ability, which he named it the Allah Akbaris, under the mistaken belief that the Arabic phrase Allahu Akbar meant heaven help us, but actually means God is great. So he wasn't a bit mistaken there, but he's got the name. And some of the best known authors from this era played here and played in Gloucestershire. Wells, Kipling, Conan Doyle. Have we got a connection to the Hound of the Baskervilles? I'd like to think so. Or War of the Worlds even. Woodhouse, Jerome K. Jerome, G.K. Chesterton, you know, Winnie the Pooh, Milne. lots and lots of these authors. Can you imagine that the joy of the local cricket club playing against some of these people? It must have been wonderful for them. Moving on, Beatrix Potter. Okay, we all know her, writer, illustrator, naturalist, and conservationist. Best known for the children's books, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, which was first published in 1902. She's written 23 tales, sold more than 250 million copies. He was also a pioneer of merchandising, and Peter Rabbit was actually the first fictional character to be made into a stuffed toy and sold. So she was, really ahead of the game in this. So again, what's the connection with Gloucestershire? Well, we know the Tailor of Gloucester, but while she was visiting her cousin, Caroline Hutton, who lived at Harescombe Grange in 1897, Beatrix Potter heard the tale of John Pritchard, who was the local Gloucester tailor. He'd been hired to make a new coat for the city's mayor, and after working late one night, had left it unfinished. But when he returned the coat to the shop the next day, the coat was completed, apart from a buttonhole and a note that read, "No more twist." In reality, his assistants had come in early and finished off the coat, but Pritchard told everyone that fairies had done the work, and it went down as a local legend in Gloucester. Potter rewrote this story, substituting mice for fairies, and it was published in 1902. Although actually Pritchard was quite a young man in his 20s, Potter made him a little old man with glasses and crooked limbs. She moved the tale back to the 1700s and also introduced Simpkin the tailor's cat, who we must all love. He's a grumpy but really friendly cat. Today, I'm sure we know, the tailor's shop is still in use as a museum and a shop, and if you've not been, it's worth a visit, please do. What's really good about this story is that for many years, Potter said that it was her favourite story. So it's nice having a favourite story about Gloucester in one of the world's most famous authors. Moving on, a little bit of, is there a connection here? Lydney, Barad-dur, the One Ring in Gloucestershire. Located on the edge of the Forest of Dean, the Roman and British temple at Lydney, which is quite an important temple, excavated by Sir Morton Wheeler in the 1928-1929 season. Among the artefacts found there was several inscriptions to the god Nodens, one of which was on a lead curse tablet. The Romans were great at cursing people, and they liked writing these little lead tablets, folding up, throwing it in the temple and letting it go. And on this curse tablet, which you can see at the top left there, was a plea about a ring that was the property of a Romano-British person called Sylvanus, which this ring appeared to have been stolen by a person called, I'm going to try and pronounce this, Sensationus. That's not right, I know. But Sylvanus invoked a curse upon him. So this sort of lead tablet here, you can see it, to the god Nodens. Sylvanus has lost a ring. He hereby gives half of it, i.e. half its value, to Nodens. Among those who were called Sensacius, do not allow help until he brings it to the temple of Nodens. So that's the plea to, bring bad luck and curse on this person called Sensacius until he returns the ring. What's really, really interesting in this story, and it's one of these magical things that happens in archaeology and history from time to time, is this ring had been discovered in 1785 in Silchester. So we have the ring and we have the curse. Now, that might have been it, but among the professionals who were involved in the 1929 Lydney dig was J.R.R. Tolkien. And it's widely thought that the curse in the ring might have been the inspiration for the One Ring in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I don't know. Is it true? I'll have to think it is. I haven't left Lord of the Rings yet. If you've read the book, you'll know there's a hobbit called Farmer Maggot who lived at Bamfurlong, a farm in the boggy region of the Marish area in the Eastern Shire. And Frodo and the party and Pippin and Merry go past this one day with Sam as well, and they stay at the house for overnight. And the Farmer Maggot takes them to the ford to help escape. Farmer Maggot's farm was well known. Frodo had been beaten there for nicking mushrooms because it was well known for mushrooms, and Maggot protected it against all trespassers and with 3 great fearsome dogs. That's, we think, what's this connection to Gloucestershire? 2015, Chris Evans of Dundry Nurseries, which is based in Bamfurlong Line. Chris lives there. He actually built a memorial to Farmer Maggot on the property there, not only because of the name, but because there are some connections. The nursery and the lands around it are quite boggy and wet, and the fields adjacent are known as the mushroom fields. And oddly enough, they used to be owned by the Buckland family, which is another name found in Lord of the Rings. So God bless him, Chris decided to put this there as a link to Lord of the Rings, and it's a nice little link. We'll finish with this lovely poem. I'm sure we've all heard of it, Addlestrop, based on a railway journey that Edward Thomas took from Paddington to Malvern in 1914, and this train stopped briefly at Addlestrop. We all know the first verse. Yes, I remember Adlestrop, the name because one afternoon of heat, the express train drew up there unwantonly. It was late June. It's a wonderful poem, really evocative. Thomas was actually new to writing, but he'd recorded these details in his book and then later wrote down the poem. You know, things like the hiss and the steam and the vegetation and the blackbirds, things that most poets had sort of missed or not looked at. Although it's not a war poem, it's become really popular in lots of anthologies because it's reference to a peaceful time and a peaceful place short time before the outbreak of the First World War. And what's again terribly sad is that Thomas enlisted the following year and he was killed in 1917, just 3 weeks before the poem was published. And that sort of brings to an end our talk today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've tried my best to sort of like do a massive, it's a massive subject, and the more I've read about it, the more you find about it. We'll take some questions in a moment. Just to highlight, the next Saturday event is on 4th of March. It's called Telling Tales, the sister presentation to this. We again focus on literature in Gloucestershire. We've got talks on Ivor Gurney, the Dimmock poets, some 6 short films called Making Words Count on forest authors. Space is limited for the talk, so although we've done actually to book in, we'd actually say it's better to book in for the talks because we do have a limit on the numbers. And finally, our next Secrets Revealed online talk will be on the 22nd of March, which will be the Secrets Revealed online talk, the best days of your life, which will be looking at school records, especially the Victorian ones held in Gloucestershire archives. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'll hand back over to Gemma now.
Right, thank you very much, John. So do we have any questions for John? If you'd like to either put them into chat or to use the raise hand facility, that would be great.
Gosh, lots of people have won in the chat there.
Just looking through, see if I've missed anybody.
Yeah, anybody. I'll have a slurp now, as Keith Floyd once said. Oh, that's very kind of you, AW.
We've got not a question, but just to say that it's been a fantastic talk, and that's from Alison. So thank you very much, Alison.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. To say, if you're interested in this, please try and come along on Saturday to the sort of the next event, because you'll hear a lot more about it. This will, of course, go online as a recorded talk at some point next week or so, and we'll also be putting together a little exhibition, an online exhibition on this. Won't include as much of the information, but it'll include some of the salient points anyway.
I think that might be it. I'm just having one last quick look through just to see if there's any other questions. Doesn't look like there are. Just check one last time.
Well, I would say is one aside, if you can get to listen to Johnny Coppins, he does a lot of his music is based on Gloucestershire poems, and there are some great songs in there. You're lucky I didn't try and sing Piper's Wood and the Song of Gloucestershire, that's all I can say, but I do often do that. But he's great.
Thank you. And just to say that Amy's just popped up a link to the next Saturday event as well in the chat if any of you want to use that. So I think we'll say a massive thank you to John Putley for such an inspiring and interesting talk. Certainly I've learned loads today, so thank you very much indeed. I'd also like to say thank you to all of you for attending today's talk. Thank you
very much.
And we hope to see you in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye folks. Thank you.
Bye-bye.